Hey everyone, and welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and it's not too late for a Top Books of 2024 video, is it? It probably is, but we're going to do it anyways. So let's just get into it. Top 15 in a vague order, descending from 15 to 1, and I'll have some honorable mentions at the end. The 15th best book that I read in 2024 is Sula by Toni Morrison. Now, Sula is a book that I just never read when I read through most of Toni Morrison's bibliography probably a decade ago, but it easily ranks in the top 3 up there with Song of Solomon and Beloved for me. We have these two women who are sort of like different sides of the same coins or shadows of each other, sort of interlocking and interlacing over a few years. Yeah, I'm not going to give a full summary of Sula. It's Toni Morrison. Read it. She's fantastic. She's wonderful. Her sentence level writing is some of the best that you get in the 20th century. It's fantastic. I'm happy I finally got to it. Number 14 on my list is Q by Luther Blissett. And this is really just one of the most fun books that I read all year. It's like 700 something pages, 750 pages or so, and it really reads more like a spy thriller or a historical fiction novel than anything else. And it's really just an epic of the German peasants' revolt in the 1520s and its subsequent decades as well. Its pace is breakneck and its scope is about as epic as you can get. I've always been really interested in Thomas Munster and the German peasants' revolt, and while Munster only makes a brief appearance at the beginning of this novel, this novel is really about the repercussions and the ramifications of his ideas and of the German peasants' revolt on the 16th century. And I'm actually reading a history book right now that I meant to bring down here, but I didn't, called The Summer of Fire and Blood by Lyndell Roper, which is all about the German peasants' revolt, and it's like a magnificent compendium to this novel, as this novel gets into so much historical detail and so many historical characters that I spent a lot of time on various Wikipedia pages while reading this book. But even with all of that scope, again, I just want to reiterate, this book is just an amazing romp through the 16th century. And really, this book is as much about the 16th century as it is about the 20th and 21st century. Luther Blissett, if you don't know, they now go by the name Wu Ming, and they're essentially a pseudonym of this anonymous Italian collective of like 4 or 5 guys who publish under these various pseudonyms, and their politics are like explicitly left-wing. They're just this really fascinating left-wing collective who are, because they're quite far left-wing, they're, well, a bit suspicious of how things are going right now. And so I'm looking forward to reading more of their books soon. Number 13 on my list is St. Sebastian's Abyss by Mark Haber. I read both St. Sebastian's Abyss and Reinhardt's Garden by Mark Haber this year. I didn't get to Lesser Ruins just yet, though I really want to. And they were both just phenomenal short novels. But St. Sebastian's Abyss really stood out to me as being both like stylistically and content-wise, just like really up my alley. This book is a scathing satire of art critics, of academics, and more generally just art enthusiasts. It follows this unnamed American narrator who travels to Berlin to visit his longtime friend, intellectual sparring partner, and enemy in Berlin as he is lying on his deathbed. And this novel is really about their history, which is a shared history of this obsession with a painting called St. Sebastian's Abyss, in which they have both dedicated their academic careers too. They have both published multiple articles, multiple books on this one painting. They're both obsessed with it, and they have argued over the course of a lifetime how best to interpret this painting. And even on one of the characters' deathbed, they're still arguing about this. And this book is really just amazing in terms of its satire, but also just in terms of like the style in which it's written. It's just phenomenal, I think, and I think Mark Haber's novels should be read a lot more, especially in online bookish spaces like this, like BookTube, where people obsess over books and really kind of craft their entire identity around allegiances to certain novels or authors or artworks more generally, in a way that often seems performative and perhaps inauthentic, or perhaps cynical, at least somewhat cynical, as these spaces are more often than not concerned more with consumerism and prestige rather than, trying to actually intellectually engage with these artworks. And I'm no exception, obviously, to any of this. But Saint Sebastian's Abyss really shows like the pitfalls and the dangers towards obsessing over art in this very kind of personal, identitarian way. And it does so in a way that is just wildly fun. I mean, I think I read this in a sitting one day. Just wildly, wildly fun. And Mark Haber is an author that is an automatic pre-order for now on, and I strongly encourage you to check out his books. Number 12 on my list is another short novel, or novella, I suppose, Roberto Bolano's By Night in Chile. This one has finally made me a Roberto Bolano fan. I have read quite a bit of Bolano. I've read 2666, I think they're just out of frame, 2666 and The Savage Detectives, and I thought both were fine, both were good. I like 2666 a bit more, but they never really fully convinced me of the Bolano hype that you see online. He never really clicked with me. By Night in Chile finally made it click. This is a compressed masterpiece, and I find that I like Bolano's compressed works like this one and like Antwerp a bit more than his sprawling, pretty unedited large works like 2666 and The Savage Detective. And also this novel, By Night in Chile, takes the form that I really quite like, which is basically just a sprawling monologue, or in this case, a confession, a deathbed confession. Sorry, the mailman is here dropping off what I assume to be more books, so we'll just give him a second. Right, back to this book. The narrator in this book is a lot of things. He's a priest, a literary critic, a teacher, but most importantly, as he's realizing here on his deathbed, he was a kind of advisor and an instructor to Pinochet. He sort of taught Pinochet what Marxism was, which is quite interesting. And so while this book is like overtly political in that sense, but what I found so interesting about this book is how it uses art, or how it talks about how the narrator uses art not as political, but as a way to actually hide his own politics, even from himself. He deludes himself into believing that art, the art space and the political space are two entirely separate theaters that have little or nothing to do with each other. And so in that, alongside this meditation on Pinochet and fascism and all this different stuff, this novel really meditates on this idea, and the narrator here joins a very long list of very seductive and enchanting narrators who try to convince you of the thing that the author probably disagrees with, which I always find to be like an interesting thing, like in Jonathan Littell's The Kindly Ones, or Nabokov's Lolita, or things like that. Anyways, people always ask where to start with Bolano. Start with this 116-page novella. And number 11 on my list is Karl Knausgard's The Third Realm, the third book in his Morning Star series. In this book, Knausgard really returns to form in this series. I think this is significantly better than The Wolves of Eternity, which was a book that I have a lot of problems with, and which I found to just be honestly quite bad for about 40% of that novel, though I realize I'm in the minority here. The Third Realm, what I really like about this novel is that it basically just runs in parallel to The Morning Star, that you get essentially the exact same scenes that we got in the first novel, The Morning Star, but we get it from a different character's perspective, and you really get it from the opposite character's perspective, the character whose voice we haven't heard yet. And so it really is worth, if you're going to read The Third Realm, it's worth reading or rereading The Morning Star. I actually reread the entire series in preparation for this, and it was very interesting to read them back to back because I've kind of felt like I was getting deja vu, but then was a bit concerned that my deja vu was giving me memories that were slightly skewed because the scenes seem so similar for the most part, but you get a completely different side of them, and so they read entirely differently. This isn't the whole book. The whole book isn't just a retelling of the Morning Star, but a significant portion of at least the first third is. And I think that the characters in the Third Realm are by and large more interesting even than the characters that we got in the Morning Star. So their interpretations of these scenes are, for my money at least, more interesting. And while still not a perfect book, I just am in that club. I have that problem with my brain that I just love Karl Knausgard's prose. I love his style, and this book was just such a relief because I thought after Wolves of Eternity I would be putting this series aside, but this is significantly better. Whereas in The Wolves of Eternity, Knausgard would spend 60 pages describing, for some reason, a teenager's soccer practice. Here in the Third Realm, he spends 60 pages describing like a death metal band's cult concert in the woods of Sweden or Norway. Yeah, I don't know. It's classic Knausgard. It's addictive. It's quite good. Next up, I don't actually have a hard copy of because it's in storage, but it's Erasure by Percival Everett. Back in March of 2024, I read, I think, 4 of Everett's novels in preparation for James coming back or coming out, and I even reread Huck Finn in preparation for that. And Erasure, for me, just stands above all the other ones that I read. James, I thought, was quite good and deserving of all the accolades that it's getting, but James, at least to me, seems the least Everett of all of Everett's books. It is the least structurally ingenuitive, it's the least laugh out loud funny, though it is funny. And it has the least complicated structure. For me, Erasure has all of those things in the best way. It's a scathing critique of the publishing industry and the way that the publishing industry self-servingly and cynically use minority voices to, 1, sell more books, and 2, to seemingly reinforce various stereotypes, but this time in a liberal and therefore more acceptable way. And Erasure was published back in 2001. Percival Everett was way ahead of the game here. Though this satire seems more important now than ever, again, especially in a place like BookTube or Bookstagram, where people sort of read novels based on the identity or nationality or language of authors, and really just to check a little box in a giant list that they're compiling, which always strikes me as a bit odd. But most importantly, Erasure is just a hilarious and fun novel. The movie that came out at the end of 2023, American Fiction, was quite good, but the structure and style of Erasure just is untranslatable to film. And so if you watched that movie and thought it was pretty good or very good, read Erasure. It's a completely unique experience where it's much more metafictional than a movie can really engage with in the way that the novel does, I guess. So yeah, I think Erasure, at least for me so far, having read like 5 or 6 of his books, I think it's his best, though my recommendation with Everett is always just read whatever you can get your hands on. He's a pretty good author. Okay, and number 9 here. I'm cheating a bit, but it is Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger and Stella Maris, which I'm just reading as one book. I read them as if they're one book. I think they should have been published as one book. Cormac McCarthy has been a favorite author of mine for well over a decade. And when this was published and McCarthy was very clearly getting towards the end of his life, I didn't want to read these books because I didn't want my reading of Cormac McCarthy to be over. And so I kept pushing it back and back and back. I also read a lot of really negative reviews early on, which might have swayed my opinion a little bit. But whatever the case, these books are phenomenal. All of those early negative reviews were just wrong. They're just wrong. These books are quite different than the rest of McCarthy's books, hence the negative reviews. But these are easily in the top half of McCarthy's novels, at least in my opinion. Stella Maris really seems to me to be, as I was talking about with Bolano, like one of those just like compressed masterpieces that somehow McCarthy was able to, late in his career, just like distill all of his works, all of the stuff he's thought about into this compressed dialogue between this young woman and a therapist or a psychiatrist. And it's really just impressive, and it's one of my favorite things that he's ever written. And Alicia, the main character of Stella Maris and a character in The Passenger as well, is just like one of my all-time favorite McCarthy characters. She's a character I wish we got a lot more of. And yeah, I mean, I think that McCarthy writes about the nuclear bomb and the Manhattan Project and all this stuff better than authors like Benjamin Labatut. And I think his characterization in these two novels is really at his best. Here, I mean, Bobby Western and Alicia are both just phenomenal characters that I love, and I look forward to returning to these books one day. And yeah, I regret waiting so long to read them. Number 8 on my list is The Case of Cem by Vera Mutafchieva, whose name I'm undoubtedly mispronouncing. This was published last year by Sandorf Passage. And this is just like a phenomenal historical fiction epic. It's almost 600 pages. Just incredible. It takes place in the 15th century in the Ottoman Empire. It's told from multiple points of view. And really what the plot is that it takes place in the wake of Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror's death, where he left behind a couple of sons who begin to essentially vie for power. Mehmed's son Bayezid assumes the throne and assumes power, but the titular Cem believes that he has a claim to this, and he's convinced by others around him that he has a claim to this throne, to this position. And so he actually flees the Ottoman Empire, and he flees to Europe, to various places in France and Italy, and tries to get the local lords there to back his claim to the throne of the Ottoman Empire. He essentially attempts to make the case for his rulership. And so this dispute between Bayezid and Cem for who gets to rule the Ottoman Empire really becomes the stage on which the East and the West conflict. You have the entire west of Europe backing Cem, and obviously the East, in the form of the Ottoman Empire, for the most part, is backing Bayezid. And the West, Western Europe, really starts to back Cem for their own reasons, of course, right? They're not going to get involved unless they're getting something out of it. And so, this is a Bulgarian epic from the mid-20th century, and what we really begin to see is this kind of larger conflict between the West and the East that is going on in the 15th century and continues to go on throughout the 20th century as well. And Mutafchieva finds a lot of traction in this narrative to kind of allegorize some of the stuff that's happening in her time period as well. But a lot of that stuff, are things that I didn't fully pick up on or fully realize because this is just a damn good historical novel. But what I liked so much about it is really the style in which this story is told. Each chapter gets a different point of view, and it really proceeds like a court case, like a legal case, where each chapter has a different point of view, and they plead their specific case for whichever side of this they're on. And the author really creates a different style and a different register for all of these different characters, if they're, French, or if they're Ottoman, if they're noble, or if they're lower class. The style in each point of view, I think, is just like wonderfully created. And so it might just be my unfamiliarity with the 15th century Ottoman Empire, with which I'm certainly unfamiliar, but this book really just read to me like a fantasy book. And I think a part of this has to do with the translation by Angela Rodell, who leaves a lot of words untranslated, whether due to kind of trying to establish a certain style or a certain tone, or because they're just not translatable words. But it really felt like I was encountering a different world in a way. And again, the way the story is told and the way the world sort of unfurls in front of us as each character tells us a little bit more about this backstory, a little bit more about the different political factions that are vying for power. It really just read to me as a lover of fantasy. It really read to me like a fantasy book. And that might just be my ignorance, of course. Most importantly, though, this book is just a lot of fun. It's epic in scope, style, voice, and it really just captures this world in which the East and the West clash. And so, like I said in the big books I want to read in 2024 video, support Sandorf Passage and other small presses that are doing things like this. Bringing a nearly 600-page Bulgarian epic into English is a rather risky endeavor, I would assume, and so we should continue to support and patronize presses that do that kind of work for us. Right, and number 7 on my list is Russell Banks' Cloud Splitter. This is another historical epic. I'm sensing a trend here, I guess. Another 750-page or so novel that is really about the abolitionist John Brown, who, for my money, is just one of the most interesting figures in American history. And really, the primary question of this novel is really the primary question that almost everyone asks when they talk about people like John Brown, which is, what is the role of violence within an oppressive system? Is violence moral? Is it ethical? Is it necessary in a system that uses violence to oppress people? This is apparently, I haven't read it, but William T. Vollmann's Rising Up and Rising Down, that 6 or 7 volume, 4,000 page treatise on violence, uses John Brown a lot as well to explore this issue. And so while this is one of the primary questions of this novel, and John Brown is, by any definition, a domestic terrorist and a freedom fighter, what I love so much about Cloud Splitter is that this book is also just one of the best books about fatherhood and about the relationship between a father and a son. This novel is written from the perspective of Owen Brown, one of John Brown's sons. And so it's really about Owen Brown later in life reflecting on his relationship with his father and reflecting on his father, who has now become, the abolitionist John Brown, a figure in history, and really kind of reflecting on how he felt through all of that and how he dealt with his father, who was, justified, I think, in a lot of the violence that he did, but was a fanatic and seemed a bit crazy. And so it's really, the standout character in this novel isn't really John Brown. It's Owen Brown, this completely innocuous figure who is just happens to be the son of one of the most famous figures of the 19th century. And so the style of this is recursive and meditative and almost diaristic in a way. This was not what I expected this book to be when I picked this up. I thought it was going to be more of a bog standard historical fiction novel, but I really think that this novel is about key questions concerning America, key questions concerning history. I don't know what my neighbor is drilling. I'm sorry if you can hear that. But this novel is stylistically a masterpiece, and content-wise, I think, a masterpiece. And again, it is, as someone with a young kid, it is also just one of my favorite books now on questions pertaining to fatherhood. Okay, and number 6 is Laurence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram, Shandy, Gentleman. This is easily one of the funniest books I've ever read, if not the funniest book I've ever read. This novel feels so postmodern that if I handed it to you without its cover and told you it was published in the 21st century, you would probably believe me. But it's actually from the 18th century. And this book, I was trying to write a couple of sentences on how to summarize this book. This book is just impossible to summarize. There's no way to summarize it. It's a maximalist, encyclopedic novel with more digressions than non-digressions, easily. This book isn't about anything, and it's also about everything. So yeah, I really don't know what else to say. I could just start reading quotes. I took so many notes, and there's so many memorable lines. I don't really know what else to say other than read this novel. Do not let the fact that it's from the 18th century and therefore old or something stop you from reading it. This book puts so many of the postmodern, maximalist, encyclopedic novels that begin to come out in the late 20th century. It puts them all to shame, and it does so with 260 years on them as well. All right, top 5. Number 5 on my list is The Melancholy Resistance by Laszlo Krasznahorkai. Krasznahorkai has been a longtime favorite of mine, and I have put off reading Melancholy because, well, I knew I would love it, and I've kind of been saving it. And yeah, I mean, I do love it. It rivals Satan Tango for me for my favorite by him. I also read earlier this year Hirsch 07769, which I'll talk about in the honorable mentions. The Melancholy Resistance is just an absolute masterpiece of apocalyptic dread. The sentence level writing here is simply up there with the best. I mean, his prose style, his voice, his themes even are constantly spiraling and circling, and yeah, it always just feels like what I'm reading is a fever dream. And I think so far from what I've read of Krasznahorkai, like no book does it more. No book takes that circling and spiraling prose style. This book is like, you know, these incredibly long sentences, in case you don't know Krasznahorkai. It takes those extremely long circling and spiraling sentences and the themes that are also like this spiraling and circling thing, and puts them together in a way that I think is just like marvelously effective. I think it's much more effectively done here than in, for instance, Hirsch 07769. And so I could open this book to any page really and start reading, and it'd be probably some of the best prose you've ever read. There's also a giant whale and a circus and an impending apocalypse. So yeah, just read it. Okay, number 4 on my list is Alexis Wright's Praiseworthy. While I never got around to making a top books of 2023 video, I have the whole thing written. I just never got around to filming it. Carpentaria was in my top 2 books of 2023, and Praiseworthy, unlike some of the other books that I read by her, like the Swan book, rivals Carpentaria as just being phenomenal. Alexis Wright, for my money, is one of the best English language writers working today. This is becoming a theme here, but you know, it's impossible to summarize this 700-page novel in a few sentences. But it's an Australian Aboriginal epic that attempts to, and I think in some ways succeeds, to capture the magnitude of the issues that are facing us generally and the Australian Aboriginal community much more specifically today, that of issues pertaining to the ramifications of colonialism and of climate change. This book is at times a satire and at other times an allegory or a parable. It's really just a parable of our times and how we treat each other and how we treat the earth, most importantly. Just like in Carpentaria, this novel resists the kind of realism that you would expect from a novel like this. If you hear it's an Aboriginal epic that explores climate change and colonialism, you're probably thinking of a certain kind of novel. This novel is not that, I don't think. I don't think you are picturing what this novel is. This novel feels more like a dream or a myth than anything else. And this makes the reading experience, for me, delightfully disorienting, though very disorienting. And again, her sentence level writing is, for me, like just some of my favorite. I absolutely love her sentences. Yeah, she's amazing. She's absolutely one of my favorite living authors, and one of my like very top English language authors, and perennially in my pick to win the Nobel Prize, or at least in my top 5 picks. People who think that English language literature is dead and they only read literature in translation, read Alexis Wright and have that opinion rectified quite quickly. Okay, and number 3 on this list is Antonio Lobo Antunes' The Inquisitor's Manual, which I've already done a full video review on, and so I'll be brief here. Lobo Antunes, this isn't a unique comparison, but he reminds me just most of all of Faulkner in so many different ways, of the way he describes like a dying and decaying community, a dying culture, etc. Really all of Antunes' novels that I've read so far are a kind of like dissection of the decay and the contagion of that decay that derives downwards from authoritarian governments, and how it spreads downward and how it poisons every aspect of individual people's lives. And I think that this is not only like spot on as to how this decay, like the contagion of decay and the death of culture and all this different stuff functions. I think that is how it works. But what is so good about Antunes is the way that he goes about exploring that. The style of this novel is something that you really just don't see that much of anymore. And again, I think the best comparison is to Faulkner. This book is incredibly polyphonic, as every, like, I don't know, 15 to 20 pages, you're put into a different character's head, and Antunes never tells you whose character's head you're in. Like, there are no chapter titles, or, well, there aren't even really chapters. But he has such a command over register and a command over voice that it's never confusing. At first, people look at this novel and they go, okay, this is one of those difficult books I'm really gonna have to, like, you know, sit down and work out. It's really not. It's an absolute joy to read. Antunes has such control over style and register that after the first 50 or so pages, you really never feel lost. Like the best of Faulkner's stream of consciousness novels, like, the style here just works perfectly, and it works perfectly in tandem with the themes that it's exploring. And so, like I did in my full review of this novel, and like I'll do again and again, I will just plead with you to read Antunes, especially now while he is still with us. I guarantee you, if you read this book, you will then spend the next few weeks picking up, as I have, everything that he has ever written, and you will quickly realize, like I have, he's written quite a lot. So yeah, Antunes, one of the greatest living authors. Read him while he's living right now. Don't wait for him to die and then to pick up his novels. Yeah, he's just fantastic. Give him the Nobel Prize. Okay, top two. Number 2 on my list is Dasa Drndic's Trieste. Drndic has been a long-time favorite of mine, and I've been holding off getting to her most lauded novel. I think it's her most lauded novel. It's a much lauded novel, and for good reason, I found out. It is phenomenal. Drndic writes in this style that can really only be described as documentary, mixing the research of a nonfiction book, but putting a thin veneer of fiction on top of that. This book is about the Holocaust, and specifically it's about the Holocaust in a region that I've never really encountered before, which is the area of sort of what is now kind of northern Croatia and northeastern Italy, that is in and around Trieste, the city of Trieste. And it's really about the capital H history of the Holocaust. The narratives, the purposeful forgetting, the obfuscation of facts that came after the Holocaust. And so while Drndic is interested in the Holocaust itself, what she is way more interested in all the books of hers that I've read, is the remnants of the Holocaust. Trieste manages to capture the absolute scale of the Holocaust and the very personalized suffering that came along with it in a way that is, well, just so effective, in a way that I've never encountered in such an effective way. She really brings the archive into fiction, and we get sections in this that are just like, well, quite famously, we get this whole section that is just like a list of names, like 9,000 names that you're forced to endure. There's other sections that are just like lists of SS officers, the crimes that they did, and then the punishments that they got for doing those crimes. And spoiler alert, the punishments they got were often nothing or very, very little. And so this is really just simply a brilliant and absolutely harrowing book. The formal elements are brilliantly done, as Trieste just mixes, again, the archive with fiction better than anyone else that I've ever read, at least. And Drndic just writes with just a scathing anger that is so palpable and so effectively conveyed that, well, it's immensely moving, I find, but it's also just something just marvelous to behold. And so, yeah, if you've never read Dasa Drndic, this is a pretty good place to start. But really, I recommend everyone read Dasa Drndic. She is a giant of the 21st century, and a very neglected giant of the 21st century. Okay, and my favorite book of 2024 is a surprise to me. I was not anticipating reading this book. I had no idea that I wanted to read this book until late last year with the oncoming of winter. I just really wanted some Russian philosophy, some just dreaded existentialism. And so I did what anyone would do in that case, and I picked up Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Yeah, I read a lot of Dostoevsky in like my late teens and early 20s, as it seems that everyone does. That seems to be where people read Dostoevsky. And I thought I was pretty much done with Dostoevsky. I read, a whole bunch of his novels. My favorite being Notes from the Underground, which I thought was just like phenomenal, but I thought that I didn't want 900 pages of that. I thought the 100-page novella was just fine. And then I was just like, I should probably read Dostoevsky. As an English teacher, as a person interested in literature, I should read the Brothers Karamazov. And yeah, I didn't think I needed 900 pages of that, but I did, and I want more. It's a good book. And I won't say that much here because everyone has said everything about Dostoevsky, it seems, especially in online bookish spaces. But yeah, it's just a phenomenal novel. It's just phenomenal. What do you want me to say? I guess if I had to say one thing about this novel, the thing I like most about Dostoevsky is Dostoevsky has an ability to stage political and religious arguments in a way that seems to be an earnest attempt at getting at a certain truth, in that he doesn't stage these arguments with his own biases infiltrating the argument in which he wants to show you why he is right. He seems, I guess, one author or one book that this novel reminded me so much of is John Milton's Paradise Lost, in the ways that the antagonists of the book are the ones who stage the philosophies and the ideas that Dostoevsky clearly disagrees with, but they are the more convincing. And I realized that by agreeing with them, you're kind of falling into Dostoevsky and Milton's trap, right? Milton sets a trap for you to agree with Lucifer. That's the whole point of Paradise Lost in a way. While that is like a trap that he's setting, it doesn't seem to me to be like cynical or disingenuous. It seems to me to be like an earnest attempt at understanding the other side, and therefore his own side as well. And so while I disagree like almost entirely with Dostoevsky's like political and religious worldviews, the Brothers Karamazov just seem to me to be so much of just an earnest and honest and sincere attempt at exploring these different opposing worldviews that plagued 19th century Russia and in a lot of ways continue to plague us today. So yeah, I'm not even gonna like begin to summarize this or anything, but don't wait to read the Brothers Karamazov. It's worth your time, I think. Don't get lost in the weird debates online that everyone just talks. Every time I show this cover, I'm gonna have 19 comments telling me that I read the wrong translation. Like, relax, it's okay. I don't know. Don't worry about that too much. Like, just read Dostoevsky. He's actually good. For once, these screaming herds of online sycophants were correct when they were yelling at you to read Dostoevsky. It's really difficult for me to not go put this 900-page Russian epic into everyone's hands and yell at them until they read it. But yeah, the screaming people online who told you to read Dostoevsky, they were right. You should read Dostoevsky. Okay, honorable mentions time. I'm going to go through these rather quickly. Honorable mentions for me these are books that if I made this list on another day, they might have made the list. I make this list on like a day, put it in an order quite quickly. And if I made this book on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday, made this list on a Tuesday instead of a Wednesday, these books may have made the list. And the first one I want to actually shout out, but I actually haven't finished it yet. And that is Alan Moore's Jerusalem, which I have 2 copies of behind me. I'm about like 4/5 the way through. And if I finished this book in 2024, it would have easily been in the top 5. This is like a massively underrated novel, massive novel, epic of the 21st century that people do not read because of its length or for various other reasons. I think this book is just phenomenal. It's just exhausting, and I needed a break, especially as there's a specific chapter that is invoking James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake that I've sort of been like stuck up on for a little bit. But Alan Moore's Jerusalem is phenomenal. It'll undoubtedly be in my top 5 of 2025. And yeah, I can't wait to get back to it. Another one I want to mention quickly, which is also behind me somewhere down here, is Dow Mossman's The Stones of Summer. This is a pretty much like forgotten epic of the 20th century. Dow Mossman wrote this book. Nobody bought it. Nobody cared about it, essentially. And he never wrote anything else ever again. There was a documentary in the early 2000s, I think, called The Stone Reader, that reinvigorated some love for this book and reinvigorated, well, this edition. Yeah, this book is an American epic, and it's very, very American. It is very, very good. The only reason why it didn't make my list is because it's mostly about childhood, and I don't really care too much about books about childhood. You know, the prose in this novel is fantastic. The style is brilliant, but yeah, I don't need like 200 pages of baseball practice and teenagers just kind of hanging out drinking. It's just like really not entirely my thing. But this book is a neglected masterpiece that people should be reading alongside the other epics of the second half of the 20th century, for sure. I don't have a copy of this with me down here, but I do want to mention Agua Viva by Clarice Lispector. Lispector's an author that I just, for some reason, I don't know exactly why it is, I've never been able to really get into her works. I've tried like 5 of her novels at this point. Agua Viva was the first one where I saw the magician or sorcerer or whatever she is. I saw Clarice Lispector and was like, okay, yeah, it's good. Yeah, I like the kind of like mystical, sort of prophetic, meditative style that she uses in that novella. And yeah, if I spent a little bit more time with it this year, it would have easily made the list. I also want to mention Solveig Bala's On the Calculation of Volume. The first 2 volumes have come out. This is going to be a septology published by New Directions, and they sent me these arcs. So take all this with that in mind. I think this is a really interesting beginning of a septology. I can't make any judgment yet because I want to read the whole series first before kind of adding it to a best of books list. I really wish they just published this as a single volume, which I know they didn't do it in Danish either, but I really wish they did here. It's repetitive, but repetitive in like a Faustian way. And so, yeah, it's pretty good. Pretty repetitive, but pretty good. We'll see how it goes. I also want to mention Jon Kalman Stephanson's, one of my favorite living authors, most recent, came out earlier this year. Your Absence is Darkness. This is phenomenal, published by a small press, Biblioasis. I love Jon Kalman Stephanson. This book actually got me to go back and reread a couple of his earlier books that I've been singing the praises for like a decade, Heaven and Hell, most emphatically. Jon Kalman Stephanson's an Icelandic author that just needs to be read more. I think he is just one of the best writers working today, period. I love his works. This book worked really well for me. I liked it a lot. I didn't like it quite as much as Jon Kalman Stephanson's books that take place earlier. This takes place more or less in modern times, and I find that Jon Kalman Stephanson's like mythic, poetic prose works better when it is talking about a time kind of further away, and so the whole story feels more like a myth or like a fable, as it kind of does in Heaven and Hell. And so, like, not my favorite Jon Kalman Stephanson necessarily, but I do want to reread it. I just saw they made an audiobook edition, so I might give it a re-listen to rejudge it. But undoubtedly one of my favorite books of the year. All right, I also want to mention, I don't have a copy of this, I have no idea where my copy went, but The Most Secret Memory of Men by Mohammed Mbougar Sarr, which is very much, well, it's often compared to Bolaño's A Savage Detectives, which I think is a fair comparison, though I think it's actually a good book. Absolutely loved that one earlier this year. I want to mention Georges Buchner's Lens, which is, I think, a 19th century work, or 18th century. Kafka before Kafka, essentially. Very, very short novella here, put out by Archipelago Books. Just fantastic, and one that I will absolutely see myself reading again and again as the years go on. During my Antunes phase, I also read a whole bunch of Jose Saramago, my favorite of which that I've read so far is Balthazar and Blamunda, which is a kind of, well, pre-modern historical epic. It feels very medieval in my mind. But yeah, Saramago kind of works for me. Not entirely. I like Antunes a lot more. And I realize that comparing those two artists might not be super fair. But in my mind, they're on the same shelf. So what do you want me to do? But yeah, Balthazar and Blamunda stuck out to me as being a fantastic novel. And I do want to read more by Saramago soon. I also read Soul Mountain by Gao Zhenjiang, which was pretty amazing. I love there's like two different styles that go back and forth. There's like an first person singular and then a second person singular format that goes back and forth. Brilliant, loved it. Elias Canetti's The Book Against Death. I already done a full review on this, but like, yeah, I don't know, 400 pages of like aphorisms and maxims and meditations on death. Fantastic. I do want to mention Laszlo Krasznahorkai's Hirsch 07769. This I was super excited for. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I do find it to be a minor Krasznahorkai, unfortunately. I think it's the most accessible of his kind of big books, right? This is over 400 pages. I think it's very accessible, which is good. But I think, yeah, I just think it pales in comparison to like the Melancholy Resistance. Yeah, like what this whole book tries to do, I think Melancholy does in a paragraph. It's still worth reading. If you like Krasznahorkai, you'll like this book. But just for me, it felt like a minor work, which is fine. And then the last one that I want to mention here is I finally got around to reading Jens Bjørneboe's Jonas, or The Least of These, as it's translated here. This is, Jens Bjørneboe is an author that I'm just like fascinated with. And I've read a few of his books in the History of Bestiality trilogy. I want to read a lot more of his stuff. He's both his books and him as a person I find to be incredibly fascinating. And so I finally got around to reading this early, very popular Norwegian novel by him. And I thought it was very good. It's mainly about like how terrible the Norwegian school system is. And so like as a teacher, it hit kind of close to home, but it also sort of the problems with the teaching industry that it explores, that has been kind of done before for me. And so if I read this back in like the 70s when it came, or the 60s or whatever, when it came out, it probably would have been pretty shocking and pretty radical. But a lot of the ideas seemed, I was already quite familiar with a lot of these ideas. And yeah, the only other book that I want to mention here, I think, and forgive me if I hit the microphone, I forgot to get it out, is Karl Ove Knausgard's A Time for Everything, which isn't my first time reading it, so it couldn't make this list. This was a reread for me. This is the first book by Knausgard that I read. This book is like in my top 10 of all time. It is absolutely phenomenal. And so I reread it before rereading the Morning Star trilogy back in like April or May. And yeah, it's solidified. This book is an all-timer. This is, I think, the best that Knausgard has written, and it's just fantastic. And so while it's not really on this list because it wasn't my first time reading it, I do want to mention it here because a lot of people read My Struggle or the new Morning Star series, especially as Penguin is just like, chucking arcs at everyone. Please, if you actually like Knausgard, please read A Time for Everything. It's his best work. It's incredible. But yeah, that's my list. I'm undoubtedly forgetting a few books here and there, but I finally had time to film this video, so I wanted to sit down and do it. Let me know what your favorite books from 2024 were. What books are you looking forward to in 2025? I know I'm already off to a pretty good reading year, reading books like Schadenfreude by Michael Lenz, currently reading The Children of the Dead by Elfriede Jelinek, and currently dipping in and out of Fernando del Paso's Palinuro of Mexico. I can never know why I can never say the author's name and that book name back to back. But yeah, off to a good reading year so far. So let me know what you're reading right now, what you're anticipating, and what your favorite books from 2024 were. Thanks for watching.